Let's try this again. Hey guys, it's here again. This is a project that I'm very excited to share with everyone. It's something that's been inspired by the work that's being done recently with Todd and with Shad and some of the other guys who are doing some really fascinating things, doing kind of vigorous testing with swords and other types of medieval arms and armor, on all the fun stuff that we kind of love to play around with and enjoy. This is meant to be about as scientifically rigorous as you would get from spending a night drinking root beer and watching a bunch of Mythbusters on TV. But the idea is that I wanted to come up with something that everyone would be able to do inexpensively at home. So I am going to be coming up with a test, or the idea is I tried to devise something that I believe that we've overlooked a little bit. We do lots of sword cutting feats, most notably with tatami, but obviously there's other cutting mediums that everyone uses. But I feel that we've really neglected the penetration or thrusting ability of swords, and there isn't any good, consistent way to either evaluate that or communicate that. And so I've been thinking about it for a long time, and the best way that we could kind of evaluate each sword on the merits for how well it is either to thrust or to penetrate a target. And there's not one good approach. I think that there are several different approaches that can be taken to it. And this is my particular attempt at it. And then I want everyone to look at it, dissect it, give it feedback, tell me why it's a terrible idea, tell me why it's a good idea, and how certainly it can be improved upon. So the way that I'm starting with this is the most important thing. This is basically like a glorified archery foam. It's very thick. I think it's 4-pound closed cell foam. And this is what's enabling us to do everything else. So for this to be a successful sort of test, I wanted it to be repeatable, affordable, consistent, and for the results to be very obvious, for it to be for anyone who'd be able to see it, to be able to immediately be able to interpret the results. It might not be as glamorous yet as tatami cutting, but it should be very intuitive as to what's happening and taking place. So this is going to be the medium into which all of the thrusting or penetration is going to happen. And I really like it. It's very dense, very hard. The previous materials I was using just were not up to snuff. I was trying styrofoam, I was trying other open cell stuff, things that were much too light. This is, I don't even know how many thrusts you get from, this is like a $20 piece that's 2 foot square, and I'd probably get more than 100, maybe 150 plus thrusts out of this block that's, I haven't even measured it. It's probably like 4 centimeters thick to mix imperial and metric measurements. So starting with this, into it, we're going to do drop tests with swords. Now this is a historically used testing type for swords. During the 19th century, drop tests were used mostly as durability tests for swords. So it's a little bit different here, but the idea is I wanted to come up with something that again would yield very consistent and repeatable results. So I was thinking about sledge, thinking about just doing thrusting with an arm, coming up with some type of a bungee or a pull mechanism, and there was no good way that I could come up with where the sword wouldn't be hitting the target with a consistent amount of force behind it. So for now, I'm using a drop test so that gravity is going to consistently bring in the sword with the same amount of force each time, as long as I'm dropping it from the same amount of distance. So here's where we start fiddling with how far it needs to go. And you could drop it from 10 feet, you could drop it from a couple of inches. I've settled on dropping it from about a foot, so 30 centimeters is what I'm doing it. And that was done through some trial and error. Again, the medium is not meant to simulate anything. So it's not meant to simulate flesh or textile or leather armor or anything like that. It's just going to be something that can be consistently tested against. Now, eventually, if the testing goes well, maybe we can add to it. We can put something in front of it to see how that changes the amount of penetration that each sword gets. But for the time being, it's just going to be a baseline, just so that we have some factor by which we can compare how all swords penetrate one another based on the properties of the sword itself. So through some preliminary analysis, I found that the 1 foot drop of a sword seemed to be yielding the type of forces that I might get from just a kind of simple from the elbow type thrust, not with the entire body weight behind it. So it seemed like a decent starting place. I wasn't ending up with issues running into the ceiling since I'm working within a basement. Obviously, the size of the sword matters a lot. Now, here's another issue. Different swords obviously come with different weights, and that's going to make a difference. If we go back to our physics, the force that the sword is hitting with is going to be a factor of mass times acceleration. So the acceleration is being taken care of gravity. We don't have to worry about that, but the mass of the sword is going to change. So I'm proposing that I record 2 different measurements. One is the measurement of just the naked sword that's being dropped. The other is going to be normalized. So in order to normalize the data recorded, I'm going to have a second series of drops for each sword where the weight of the swords are all brought to the same amount of mass. And for the time being, the mass I'm using is 2.5 kilograms, in part because it's a nice round number, and in part because that's the weight of the largest sword in my collection. So every sword will be dropped just on its own weight and see how deep it gets. And then that same sword will have enough weight added to it that the total mass of the system will be 2.5 kilograms and then dropped again. So that normalized data, I think, will be actually what is most interesting, to see if the swords are being all thrust with the same force, how deep will they get? And then you can compare that number to the weight of the sword just by itself. And it's a little interesting because in sword fighting, the mass of a sword will be both an advantage and a disadvantage. A lighter sword is easier to accelerate quickly, but at the same time, it has less inertia. So once it meets resistance, it'll be more inclined to stop quickly. It will not want to travel through a target of resistance. So there are advantages and disadvantages in thrusting to having more or less mass of the sword. So in the data table, which I'll show now through magic, you'll see that I have all of these drops being recorded, and you'll see the mass, you'll see the distance. So the way that it's done is on the sword, I will just graduate out the tip and we'll just measure exactly how deep it gets. And the deeper it penetrates, obviously, the better the score, the better the penetration, to quote Matt Easton. And on the test where it's done where 2.5 kilograms is the total weight of the unit, that will be the largest score typically. And then there'll be a fraction of that depth, that total depth, that is how deep it gets when it's only the weight of the sword. So each sword will have at least 2 scores. And then the final measure, I'll also measure how much flexibility that each sword has, using the Black Fencer and Nick Thomas approved method for determining how much a sword bows on a scale when weight is applied to the top of it. So that's what's going to happen. So going forward, whenever I'm reviewing or looking at a sword, I will also be doing these drop tests. So these penetration / thrusting potentials for the sword. And we can talk about the tip, we can talk about cross-section, we can talk about things that will influence how well it thrusts. It's true that I'm doing this a little bit in the abstract, so there are going to be limitations. Obviously, the type of grip a sword has may make it easier or more difficult to apply the same amount of leverage. A sword like this that has very little hand stop on it might make it much more difficult to have a good grip on the sword if you hit a resistive target. And trying to make your hand skate up a sword, whereas something like an S-Talk that has a huge flat grip, you may be able to get a tremendous amount of leverage on it and transfer a very clean amount of force into the sword for thrusting purposes. But anyway, it's a starting place, and it's something that I really haven't seen explored yet. If someone is doing thrusting out there, I'd love to hear it and love to hear what you're doing. But it's something new, and I'd love to hear everyone else's thoughts on it. So going forward, love to hear the conversation continue. Take care.